The lonely rancher had sheltered the wife of an Apache chief last night. The very next morning, 200 warriors came to take his life. Welcome to Wild West storytelling. Let's get started. That dawn carried no birdsong, no familiar scent of dry grass on the high plains. Instead, there was a heavy silence, so thick that Elias Ward felt as though the earth itself was holding its breath. He stood motionless inside his weathered gray cabin, his calloused hand trembling on a cup of cold coffee. Through the dusty window, a sight sent a chill racing down his spine. Hundreds of Apache warriors lined along the rotting fence, their faces painted in fierce colors, silent as living statues. No one moved. No one spoke. They only stared straight at his solitary cabin. Elias was no stranger to the desert's loneliness, nor to the wailing wind that howled through the cliffs. But he had never known a silence like this, the kind that pressed on his chest, the kind that told him a single wrong move could summon death. A former soldier who had tasted enough gunpowder and blood, he understood one thing: silence was more dangerous than the roar of battle. One question tore at his mind: why were they here? He was just an old rancher, living in isolation for 10 long years, keeping clear of everyone. Why would they surround him as if he were their sworn enemy? There was only one explanation. The night before, he had opened his barn doors to rescue a woman who had collapsed in the storm. He had given her shelter, even pressed into her hand his father's old dagger so she could protect herself. And now, with 200 blazing eyes fixed on his cabin, Elias knew. That woman was no ordinary wanderer. Thank you for allowing me to serve you tonight. All I hope is that you remain safe, and that happiness finds you, wherever you may be listening to this story. Elias Ward had lived alone on this land for nearly 10 years. Ever since his wife and young son had died from a winter fever, he had built high fences, planted a few apple trees, and locked his heart away as though it, too, had been buried alongside the 2 graves behind his ranch. The townsfolk called him the Old Wolf of the Dunes, half an insult, half a mark of respect. For anyone who could survive this long on the brutal frontier was not a man to take lightly. His wooden cabin stood solitary in a sea of dry grass, its back pressed against the red cliffs, its front opening onto plains that stretched clear to the horizon. Day after day, his world was nothing but the crow of roosters, the neighing of horses, and the endless whistle of the wind. Over time, loneliness became habit, and silence turned into his only companion. The night before, the sky had collapsed in a violent storm. The wind howled like a demon, thunder split apart the darkness, and lightning slashed through the heavens. While Elias was securing the horse stable, he caught sight of a figure staggering through the sheets of rain. A woman. Her long black hair clung to her pale face, her leather dress soaked through. She moved as though each step was a battle against some unseen enemy. "You need shelter," Elias rasped, raising his voice above the thunder. The woman turned, and in a flash of lightning, he saw her eyes deep, dark, filled with both fear and defiance. She shook her head and whispered, "I cannot stay. My people, they will worry." But then the icy wind struck again, and her body trembled. In that moment, Elias remembered his mother's words from long ago. When you see someone in need, do not ask who they are. Just offer your hand. Without hesitation, he unfastened the silver dagger at his belt, the only keepsake left from his father's days of war. He placed it in her hand, then draped a heavy wool blanket over her shoulders. "Keep it until the storm clears," Elias said. She looked at the dagger, her fingers trembling, as though it was more than a weapon, as though it carried the weight of an oath. When she raised her eyes again, her gaze pierced him, and Elias felt as if his scarred heart had just been touched for the first time in years. "I will remember your name," she whispered. Elias Ward. Before he could invite her into the cabin, she vanished into the storm like a ghost, leaving behind only hurried footprints in the mud. And this morning, 200 Apache warriors standing silent beyond the fence were the answer. That woman was no stranger. She was the wife of Chief White Crow, the fierce leader of the Apache in this land. Now Elias understood why the entire tribe looked upon him with suspicion, as if his single act of kindness last night had sparked a storm far more dangerous than nature itself. The wooden door trembled with a heavy rhythm. Elias set down his cup of coffee, his calloused hands clenching tight. He knew it was only a matter of time before he had to face them. Outside, horses stirred restlessly. But the Apache warriors stood still, silent as ghosts beneath the rising sun. Then, a figure stepped forward from their ranks, tall, broad-shouldered, draped in white wolf pelts, with eagle feathers crowning his headdress. His eyes were dark and unreadable, carrying the terrifying calm of a man who commanded hundreds of lives. Elias Ward. The deep voice rang out, steady and sharp, without a trace of hesitation. "You know why we are here." Elias drew a slow breath, opened the door, and stepped onto the porch. "I do not," he answered, his voice rough from last night's whiskey, though his gaze did not waver. The chief gave a small nod, as if the reply only confirmed what he had already believed. "I am White Crow, and the woman you met last night," his eyes narrowed, sharp as a spear point, "is my wife." The words struck like a stone tumbling through a canyon. Elias froze, the image of the trembling woman in the storm flashing back to him, her hand clutching the dagger, her sad smile, her warning whispered in the wind. "If they know I am here, you will be in danger too." Elias swallowed hard and shook his head. "She was exhausted. I only gave her shelter. I did not know who she was." White Crow stepped closer, his expression calm but his presence storm-like. "The dagger in her hand, it was yours." "Yes," Elias admitted. "Only so she could defend herself." The line of warriors rippled with murmurs, like wind stirring restless grass. Among the Apache, a dagger was not merely a weapon, it was a vow, a sacred bond of trust. For an old rancher to place it in the hands of a chief's wife was nothing short of crossing into forbidden ground. White Crow's eyes narrowed, searching Elias as though he could peel away every hidden truth. "Do you know?" he said softly. "In our people, a woman takes a weapon only from the one she trusts with her life." Silence fell heavy. Sweat broke across Elias's brow, though the morning air was still cold. He had not meant to trespass into their sacred laws, yet the truth had dragged him into the heart of it. From within the ranks, a voice suddenly shouted, "If Naira was here, then he knows where she is." The name cut the air like a blade. Elias stiffened. Now he knew her name, Naira, and he knew this was no longer a matter of nameless kindness. White Crow raised his hand, silencing the warriors. His gaze locked on Elias, both a judgment and a plea. "My wife vanished last night. She has not returned to the camp, and you are the last man to see her alive." Elias swallowed the knot in his throat, his hand drifting to the grip of his revolver. In that instant, he understood. Fate had bound him to a storm from which there was no escape. "Amdakimcha." Elias could not remember when he had nodded. Perhaps it was in that moment when White Crow's eyes met his eyes that carried both threat and desperate plea. The eyes of a husband ready to turn the prairie into a sea of blood just to find his wife. The old loner had little left to lose. Yet the instinct to survive would not let him refuse. And so, not long after, Elias found himself astride a horse, riding among the Apache warriors as they thundered north toward the land of stone and forest. The wind swept through the cactus thickets, carrying with it the pounding hooves that sounded like war drums. Elias felt the wary gazes of the warriors around him. They watched him as though he were a condemned man being escorted to the gallows. Yet strangely, deep inside, Elias felt more alive than he had in years. For so long, his mornings had been nothing but milking cows, and his nights, drowning in whiskey to forget the emptiness. Now, under the cold stares of 100 eyes, his heart beat fast, like the days of his youth when he carried a rifle into battle. The riders halted near a cluster of trees. White Crow dismounted and bent low, his weathered fingers brushing faint marks in the dry mud. He spoke softly in his native tongue, then turned to Elias. "Naira's tracks. She passed here, but she was not alone." Elias slid down from the saddle, straining to see. Indeed, larger footprints pressed deep into the earth beside hers. The memory of Naira in the storm surged back, her eyes wild with fear, her constant glances over her shoulder. Elias understood then. She had not been running from her husband. She had been running from someone else. She was afraid, Elias murmured, almost confessing to himself. Not of me, but of someone chasing her. White Crow gave a brief nod, a rare flicker of agreement in his gaze. "You saw what I did not. Perhaps you are not lying." The admission did little to soften the hatred in the warrior's eyes, yet it planted something strange within Elias. The feeling of being heard. For years, no one had cared for his words. Not even he had bothered to listen to himself. That night, they camped by a stream. Elias sat alone by the fire, turning an old pipe between his hands. He listened to the horses breathe, to the men speaking in a language he only half understood. In that moment, he realized he was standing on the border of two worlds, one of loneliness that had imprisoned him for a decade, and another of fierce but unbreakable kinship. And between them, a mysterious woman who carried a storm in her shadow. Elias drew a long breath of smoke and lifted his eyes to the vast, starless sky. He knew then, if Naira was still alive, he would have to follow this trail with them to its very end, not to save her, but to uncover why fate had dragged him, an unknown hermit, into this game of life and death. Thank you for being here. If this story has stirred memories of days long gone, of dusty sunsets and the echo of hoofbeats in your heart, then subscribe to my channel, so that every day we can sit together once more, and I will share with you another tale of the Wild West. By noon the next day, the sun poured fire onto the prairie, scorching the earth beneath their horses. White Crow's party rode into a narrow canyon, its cliffs rising sheer on both sides, the wind screaming through like a funeral trumpet. A chill ran down Elias's spine. He had been a soldier once, had seen many battlefields, and he knew this truth well. Where silence lingered too long, death was waiting. Suddenly, an arrow whistled past, striking hard into a tree trunk inches from Elias's face. An instant later, war cries exploded through the air, shadows leapt from the cliff walls, and a rain of arrows and spears came down like a storm. "Ambush!" an Apache warrior shouted. The riders scattered at once, raising spears and drawing bows in a desperate defense. Elias threw himself from his horse, pressing flat against a boulder, his hand reaching for the worn rifle at his side. The crack of gunfire split the chaos, smoke filling the canyon, mingling with the screams of men and the shrill cries of horses. But in the torrent of arrows, Elias's sharp eye caught something wrong. One Apache among their ranks was not panicked. Standing on a ledge above, he moved his hands in subtle gestures, signals, clear and practiced. Battle signs. "Betrayal," Elias muttered, his blood turning cold. He sprang up and roared toward White Crow. "Look there! One of your own, he is guiding them." White Crow's gaze snapped to where Elias pointed. In an instant, his face twisted into fury. He drew his bow and loosed an arrow like thunder. It struck deep into the traitor's shoulder, flinging him from the cliff. The cries of the ambushers faltered, shaken at the sudden turn. They had not expected their inside man to be exposed. The Apache warriors seized the moment, counterattacking with brutal force. Elias, though long removed from real combat, steadied his rifle and fired, cutting down an enemy warrior whose spear had been aimed straight for White Crow's flank. When the dust began to settle, the canyon was littered with corpses, the stench of blood heavy in the air. The survivors fled into the forest, but through the groans of the wounded, Elias heard something that froze him still. The fallen traitor was not yet dead. Gasping for breath, he whispered a single name, "Naira." Elias dropped to his knees, clutching the man's shoulder. "Where is she?" The traitor's lips twisted in a ragged smile, blood trailing from the corner of his mouth. "She is the bait, and you have walked into the trap." His eyes went wide, then dimmed to nothing. Elias lifted his head and met White Crow's darkened stare. He knew then this ambush was only the beginning. Their enemy did not merely seek to capture the chief's wife. They wanted to destroy the Apache tribe itself. And now Elias, too, had been drawn into the bloody game, where a single misstep would cost him his life. The smoke still clung to the canyon, leaving a bitter stench on the sun-scorched stone. White Crow stood in silence over the traitor's body, his face unreadable, though his eyes burned like embers buried deep in ash. He gave no order for burial, spoke no word of mourning. Instead, he turned to Elias, his voice low and rough. "You have seen it. There are those within my own tribe who would sell their blood for power. And my wife, she is in their hands." Elias wiped sweat and gunpowder dust from his brow, his heart still pounding. He wanted no part of this. Yet in White Crow's gaze he saw more than anger. He saw the raw pain of a man terrified of losing the one he loved most. It was a pain Elias knew all too well, The day he buried his wife and son beneath the same mound of earth. "Where have they taken her?" Elias asked, his voice hoarse. White Crow bent to the ground, tracing the print still pressed into the damp soil. Smaller footsteps dragged hastily, mixed with the heavy boots of men. "To the west," he said, "to the Valley of Horsebones." The name made several warriors shudder. Elias glanced at them, not understanding, but their faces told him enough. That valley was a cursed place, where an entire cavalry had once been swallowed by a sandstorm. The Apache believed the spirits of those warriors still wandered there. "They chose that valley because they believe fear will keep us away," White Crow went on. "But I will go, and you, Elias Ward, will go with me." Elias tightened his grip on the rifle slung across his shoulder. He could have refused, turned back toward his lonely ranch, left them to their fate. But the image of Naira in the storm returned, the fear in her eyes, the trembling hand clutching his dagger as if it were her last chance to stay alive. She had not only taken the relic of his family, but also carried with her a promise left unspoken. "Very well," Elias said simply. "I will go." That night, as the party camped at the forest's edge, Elias sat alone by the fire. White Crow approached, setting down a small leather pouch beside him. Inside was a silver necklace, carved with the shape of a crow. "Naira's," he said. "She would never abandon it, unless she was forced. Wear it. Perhaps it will help you remember her, when the time comes." Elias closed his fingers around the pendant, its cold weight seeping into his chest. He looked at the Apache chief, the same man who hours before might have killed him without hesitation. Now they sat side by the same fire, bound by a shared fear, a shared purpose. In that moment, Elias understood. He was no longer the forgotten rancher, lost in the emptiness of the prairie. He was part of the search now, part of the tribe's fate. And the road to the Valley of Horsebones would decide not only Naira's future, but his very life. The road into the Valley of Horsebones was like a descent into hell. The wind screamed, whipping red dust into blinding clouds, while bleached white bones lay scattered across the ground like grim reminders of death's visit long ago. Riding among the Apache warriors, Elias felt his chest tighten. He thought of the graves of his wife and son on the hillside, of the years of solitude he had spent hiding a shattered heart. Then a cry rose from the front. "Tracks!" White Crow spurred his horse forward, pointing to drag marks etched into the sand. The riders surged after him, and at the valley's end, they saw Naira bound to a wooden post, her face weathered but her eyes still burning with fire. Around her stood the traders, their blades gleaming in the dying light. The two sides faced each other in the blood-red glow of sunset. A voice rang out, taunting. "Lay down your weapons. White Crow, kneel and confess defeat, and your wife lives." Tension strung the air tight as a bowstring. Then Elias urged his horse forward, his rough voice echoing through the canyon. "You are mistaken. This woman is not only the wife of a chief. She is proof that honor and loyalty cannot be traded away." The words, spoken by a nameless, solitary rancher, fell over the valley like thunder. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. White Crow turned to Elias, his eyes flashing with something between shock and respect. The battle erupted with fury. But this time Elias no longer felt like an outsider. He charged in, cutting down an archer aiming for Naira, then slashed through her bindings with his own dagger. Naira collapsed into his arms, her eyes blazing with trust. "I knew you would come." When the dust settled, the betrayers lay bound, and Naira was safe within the circle of her people. White Crow placed a heavy hand on Elias's shoulder, his voice resonant as a war drum. "You have saved my wife. But more than that, you have saved the honor of our tribe. From this day on, Elias Ward, you are no longer the lone man of the prairie. You are our brother." Elias said nothing. The wind carried the songs of the warriors, mingling with the thunder of horses. In that moment, he understood. Kindness, even the smallest act, could bend the course of fate. A dagger offered in a storm had turned a broken man into one who had rediscovered the meaning of life. That truth echoed within him like a flame that would never die. Sometimes, mercy does not only save another, it saves yourself. The sun sank slowly behind the distant mountains, painting the Valley of Horsebones in a sea of blazing red and orange. The Apache warriors gathered around the fire of victory, their drums and songs echoing through the open air. In the circle of flame and shadow, Elias Ward sat in silence, his hand wrapped tightly around the dagger that had returned to him. Upon its scarred steel blade, the sunset glimmered as though retelling the story that had just been written. White Crow approached, leading Naira beside him. The chief's face bore the lines of hardship, yet his eyes shone with pride. He placed a firm hand on Elias's shoulder, his deep voice solemn and warm. "From this day, you are no longer a stranger. You have shed blood with us. You have risked your life for one of our own. Elias Ward, you have a place in this fire." Naira tilted her head gently, her dark eyes resting on Elias. It was no longer the look of terror from the storm, but a gaze filled with gratitude and respect. She placed the silver necklace carved with the crow into his hand. "Keep it, to remember that on a night of storm and fear, you chose mercy instead of turning away." Elias hesitated, his hand trembling as he closed it around the pendant. For so many years he had locked himself inside grief, believing there was no place left for him in the world. Yet tonight, beneath the firelight and the voices of the tribe, he saw the truth. Even the smallest act of kindness could open a door, guiding a man from darkness back into the light. He lifted his eyes to the burning sky and allowed himself a faint smile. "Perhaps I am not alone anymore," he thought. The Apache set out toward the horizon, carrying with them the story of an old rancher who dared to stand on the edge of life and death for the sake of honor. And from that day on, across the harsh frontier, people spoke of Elias Ward by a new name. Brother of the White Crow tribe. A message to the audience. In the storm-torn West, sometimes a single act offering a hand in the rain or placing a dagger into another's grasp can change the course of destiny. Elias had lost everything, yet through mercy, he found a greater family and a reason to live again. If you have ever felt lost or alone, remember this. One act of kindness can open a new path. Thank you for following this story. If you wish to hear more journeys from the frontier where men and women must choose between fear and courage, then subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. Every word you share is a flame that keeps these tales of the Wild West alive.